My new book is called End of Its Rope, and it's about the implications of the end of the death penalty for American criminal justice. I study why the death penalty has declined for 2.5 decades now. I think it's one of the most remarkable trends in American criminal justice history. We were a leading country in death sentencing, and now we're sentencing hardly anyone to death. I don't think people realize this. We have states like Texas that are down to just a handful of death sentences a year. States like Virginia, which used to be second to Texas, which has sentenced no one to death in 7 years. The counties like Houston that used to lead the country in death sentencing aren't doing it anymore at all. No one expected this to happen. No one predicted that it would happen, and it has happened. What we found, number one, was that the decline in murders that began in the 1990s in this country strongly impacted death sentencing. Counties and states that had fewer murders started to death sentence less. The second thing we found, though, was that at the state level, there was a huge impact of improved defense lawyering in the form of creating a statewide office to handle death penalty trials. Having a better defense brought death sentences down far more than just the murder decline alone. And there are never very many murders that turn into death penalty cases. 10,000, 15,000 people a year get murdered in this country, and yet there are only a handful of death sentences that come from that. So we knew that something aside from the murder decline had to be accounting for this. Third, we looked more carefully at the decline in murders and found that, well, it's not just the number of murders that turn into death sentences. We found a very troubling racial pattern. And so it's the number of white victims of murder that are most strongly correlated with death sentencing. Whereas counties which had black victimization in murders go up, no effect on death sentencing. And so only some white lives have mattered for death sentencing in this country. And fourth, a huge factor in death sentencing has nothing to do with the murder rates, has nothing to do with the defense necessarily, but it has a lot to do with the inertia, path dependency, or muscle memory in these counties. We suspect a lot of it has to do with prosecutors' offices. If an office has a death sentence, they're much, much more likely to death sentence someone else in the year after that, the year after that. There's this path dependency effect. Counties that sentence to death keep doing it, but then if they stop, they really stop. And as cost and other factors have made it harder to bring death penalty cases to trial, some counties have just decided the death penalty isn't worth the cost. The last time we had a crime wave, the death penalty didn't help. Countries that had the same crime wave, like Canada, that had no death penalty, they did fine. Their crime went down the same way ours did without the death penalty. The costs of the death penalty and the exonerations, the innocent people who served time on death row, all the problems with appeals and reversals and errors, none of those helped to deal with the underlying problem, which was a serious crime wave. So we need to think about ways to reduce crime, but the death penalty isn't the right approach. So I hope we've learned something from our gut response to the last crime wave in this country, if we have another one. And if we don't have another crime wave, then I think this momentum towards reducing severe punishments and towards the death penalty dying on the vine, I think that'll continue. I hope people who are just interested in criminal justice, interested in justice in this country, read my book. There's detailed statistical analysis I did, but I've published that data in more technical law review articles. In this book, I give examples. I tell the stories of high-profile death penalty cases to show how these cases unfold. How does mental illness get litigated in a death penalty case? For example, I tell the story of the Aurora Theater shootings, one of the biggest mass shootings in recent history in America, the biggest in Colorado in recent history, and how the jury in that case came around towards a life without parole option for this horrible mass murderer, this person who is the biggest demon you can imagine on the stand in a criminal case. The jury chose life. I tell the stories of people who served decades on death row. It turns out they were innocent, and how difficult it was to prove innocence, how easy it was to sentence people to death, even despite the fact that there wasn't much evidence of their guilt back in the day when we were sentencing lots and lots of people to prison. And I also tell the story of how the death penalty has declined and what's changed in the states, how because of cost concerns, even in rural Texas, there's a murder insurance scheme where counties have banded together because they just can't afford the cost of the death penalty anymore. And so the idea is I want to tell stories of the changing landscape of the American death penalty so people can read about these cases and get a sense of how it fits into this larger pattern that we're moving away from the most severe forms of punishment in this country.